director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. We're starting a few minutes late. We're coming from a private breakfast with a few of the speakers, but I'd like to begin today's discussion. First, Deputies Americo de Gracia, Miguel Pizarro, Juan Andres Mejia. I'd like to first begin today's discussion by congratulating you as National Assembly members and the National Assembly overall in the re-election of Juan Guaido as president of the body this week. As all of you know, the Atlantic Council, and we're joined today by the Council's Executive Vice President, Damon Wilson. The Atlantic Council will continue to be all in to move the needle and work concretely to advance a democratic transition in Venezuela. It is pivotal, and it becomes more and more pivotal by the day, as you will learn about during today's discussion of the vast reverberations of the criminality in Venezuela currently. Before I continue, please also feel free to get out your telephones during this conversation, but only to tweet about all the insight using the hashtag #ACVenezuela. Also, part of this discussion will be, majority of the discussion will be in Spanish. So if you didn't get translation on the way in, raise your hand and someone will bring you translation. As the events of earlier this week show, 2020 is going to be a pivotal year for the country's future and for that of the region. And countries like Russia in particular, but also Iran, Turkey, Cuba, and others have a vital strategic interest in keeping Nicolás Maduro in place. But Maduro remaining in power has consequences that are far beyond hyperinflation, far beyond human rights abuses, and far beyond political persecution, including of many of the deputies that are here today. Illegal activity, new and old, has flourished under Nicolás Maduro's reign, and we will see that today. We will see how illegal mining has destroyed vast swaths of the national territory. We will see how illegal activities have displaced indigenous people, forcing them from their homelands of generations. And we will see the dark underside of illegal mining activities. The criminal and terrorist groups it invites, from the ELN and the FARC to Hezbollah and Hamas. The global illicit economies that it finances, and the disruption and criminality it spreads to neighboring countries and beyond. Today's event is an important marker in raising the importance of addressing illegal resource extraction head on. It's about the environment, it's about indigenous people, and it's about illicit economies and global terror. And offering solutions and ideas of how Washington and the global community can partner with the interim government in combating this. I'd like to first also congratulate Deputy Americo de Gracia in the front row here, who was named last month by interim President Guaido as Presidential Commissioner for the Mining Arc. We are thrilled to host you, Americo. Es un gran placer tenerle aquí in your first public appearance in the U.S. since being appointed to this position. America will join a conversation with Deputy Miguel Pizarro, who was named in September as Presidential Commissioner to the United Nations and has done a stellar job in that role, and with our own Diego Area, that will be stealthily moderated by NTN 24's Emiliana Molina. Afterwards, I will steer a bipartisan conversation with Representatives Debbie Wasserman Schultz, co-chair of the Venezuela Caucus, and Representative Francis Rooney, ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Civilian Security and Trade Subcommittee in the House of Representatives. So with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Emiliana Molina, Diego Area, Deputy Miguel Pizarro, and Deputy Americo de Gracia. Please join me in welcoming the stage.
¿Cómo estás, Américo? Un gusto, bienvenido. Lo mismo, creo que sí. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos por...
Thank you, everyone, for coming and for joining us on this panel. I'm going to introduce our panel from left to right. We have Americo de Gracia, who is a National Assembly representative from the state of Bolívar and Presidential Commissioner for the Mining Arc. Congratulations for your first public appearance. Then we have Miguel Pizarro, a National Assembly representative as well from the state of Miranda and the Presidential Commissioner to the United Nations. And lastly, we have the Associate Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council, Diego Ardia. Let's start with Miguel and your experience as a deputy. What happened in these recent elections on Sunday, and how do you explain it to somebody who is not very familiar with what's happening in Venezuela, that now there are going to be 3 different assemblies or 3 different presidents operating in Venezuela? How would you explain how they tried to prevent Juan Guaido's reelection, but that he ultimately was able to be reelected? Thank you, Emiliana. Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for this opportunity. Just to provide you with some context, just imagine we're not talking about Venezuela, we're talking about the U.S. Capitol. And that the day the session begins, that the police or National Guard decides which members of Congress or Senate can enter the building and who cannot. And that the military takes control of the legislative chamber and who can vote for the leadership and who cannot. That's exactly what happened in Venezuela. The National Assembly and the legislature, by constitutional mandate, has a specific date and time to be installed. It has to be January 5th of every year. The leadership of the National Assembly is elected. What happened on Sunday in Caracas, and I can sum this up very specifically. First, there was a military takeover of the Legislative Palace and military control of legislative work, and then a fraudulent election in an attempt to usurp the functions. In Venezuela, there aren't 2 leaders. There aren't 2 different national assemblies. There's a single leader and a single National Assembly elected by 100 deputies. There are 167 members of the National Assembly. When we were elected in 2015, we had 112 seats. That's 2/3 of the National Assembly. But if I talk about how we got to January 5th, after more than 30 convictions of members of parliament. Here, you have 4. All of us have been sentenced, pursued, and forced to flee our country. On January 5th, you had Juan Requesens. He had been imprisoned more than 15 days. And Dean Bercaro, who is a deputy elected, who had disappeared. One who was detained by intelligence bodies of the state, and 20 days later, we don't know where he is. He has been disappeared by the intelligence agencies. But I do think we need to see the deeply positive side about this. If we had talked about this in December, people would have been asking whether or not Juan Guaido and the interim government were capable of leadership. There was some uncertainty about the future of Venezuela and the possibility for a transition. But on January 5th, 100 deputies, the vast majority, but the United Democratic Forces voted to keep Juan Guaido as the president of the National Assembly. And there are 2 ways to interpret this. You can see unity. People have united behind Juan Guaido and his leadership. And then this is a show of resistance and strength of those who resisted blackmail. And it's this idea of silver or lead, plata o plomo. So you either take the money or they run you out of the country, which is what happened to many of us. Thank you very much.
Para hacerle un
A quick follow-up question. The U.S. and other countries have recognized Juan Guaido as the Speaker of the Assembly, but Luis Parra was also sworn in. So as 2020 begins, will we have a Guaido-led session on Monday and a Parra-led session on Tuesday? The National Assembly is not a physical place. it is the parliamentarians, and our constitution allows them to meet wherever they may need to meet. And we have to preach by example. We cannot ask the people to act differently than the leaders themselves act. And I think that it was great to see Guaido pushing past riot shields and jumping over a fence, pushing past that picket. That is showing physically that we need to resist. Now, it is a strange environment to continue in. The regime is playing at getting people to forget about politics. They want to make it harder and harder for the international community to understand what's going on in Venezuela. They want things to keep going in circles, and they want to wear us down. And the only thing that works there is to stand firm and to keep the National Assembly alive as the only legitimate manifestation of power and the voice of the people in Venezuela. And Deputy de Gracia, you were recently named a presidential commissioner for the Orinoco mining arc. What groups are involved in illegal mining, and what are their links to the regime? Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. In Venezuela, and I know it's hard for civilized countries to imagine this, but here we do have the national government involved with criminal organizations. And this goes back to when Chavez was president and continues to this day. There have been at least 4 types of armed groups involved in this area that lies to the south of the Orinoco River, which is known as the Orinoco Mining Arc. There is a Venezuelan term called PRAN. Don't look for it in any Spanish dictionary. You won't find it. PRAN is a term used for criminals. They're the prison gang leaders. And they took those out and put them in charge of 1,900 different mining operations across the region from the states of Amazonas, Tamacuro, and Bolivar. Then you have what are known as the colectivos, these irregular paramilitary groups that are politically involved, have political ties to the regime. And then we have terrorist groups, the ELN, the FARC, and of course Hezbollah and Hamas. The latter 2 are found in specific mining areas. They are providing mining expertise and doing exploration. But it is mainly the ELN that has been the most visible, has the most visible presence across this mining belt. And they've received a mandate from the government to work there. And then 4th, and at the top of the pyramid, that's why I mentioned them last, we have the Venezuelan armed forces, which are not loyal to Maduro. They are accomplices. And this is an important distinction because they assign land through a company, Caminpain Gas and Petroleum Mining Corporation. And that company, led by the Ministry of Defense, allocates land and operations to different groups. It decides who works and where, who's going to get what share of the money. And the gold thus mined is mainly and mostly smuggled out. A little bit goes to the Venezuelan central bank, but the bulk of it goes through well, the part that goes to the state goes through Minerven. This is part of the government, and there it is. President Caldera, who nationalized gold back in 1970, set up Minerven back then. But other than that small percentage, most of it goes through Suriname, then to Nicaragua, Turkey, Russia, etc. And it's very important that all of you here, the select audience, understand that there are two other mining activities. And there, not even $1 goes to the national treasuries. And this is the mining of diamond and coltan. And then we've got thorium, a strategic mineral used by Iran and Russia for the construction of missiles. So this makes the Guayana region very strategic. When we talk about the Guayana region, we're talking about those three states I mentioned, Amazonas, Bolivar, and the Delta. Those are the three states that are in this mining arc and are suffering these ecological disasters and the presence of these armed groups who are, of course, supporting this criminal activity and are responsible for extracting and smuggling out these materials to certain strategic countries in the country. And that is why we consider Nicolás Maduro's regime to be a criminal organization. It cannot be considered a regular government. This isn't just any president. This is an international criminal organization guilty of everything that Deputy Pizarro laid out as well. And I want to add one more thing. An act such as the one described by my colleague Pizarro, ultimately an assault on the National Assembly and on the Venezuelan people. Why? Why did this happen? We believe that this was an express demand imposed by Russia. The National Assembly is the only branch of government, according to the Constitution, that can authorize extraction of minerals, whether it's bauxite, gold, uranium, or thorium, any material. The National Assembly is the only power. There is no other one, constitutionally, not the Constituent Assembly, which cannot issue any type of natural resource concession. It works like this. The government can approve a concession for petroleum, oil, but it is the National Assembly that authorizes that. This was established in the Constitution of 1810, and it has been so all the way through to today's Constitution. It has never been different in any Venezuelan constitution, and that is why the Russians want to get a hold of the National Assembly so that they can then legitimize their sacking and looting of Venezuela. Just quickly, you mentioned that ELN is one of these groups. What is the strategy behind that? Why ELN and not Hezbollah? Well, Hezbollah is keeping a low profile, as is Hamas. FARC, of course, has signed peace accords in Colombia, and they're keeping a low profile for that reason. But the ELN is becoming a true threat for Colombia, Brazil, and of course the U.S. Because the issue is that if there were hypothetically an intervention, you'd then see a balkanization of Venezuela, you'd have a much more costly war. And of course, they are providing ideological and military backing to the regime led by Nicolás Maduro. Nobody gives something for nothing. And in this case, what Venezuela, Maduro is offering these terrorist groups is financing. They can finance themselves from the resources in exchange for support of the regime. And again, this has been happening for a long time, but it's been strengthened under Maduro. And as to the revenues from coltan and diamonds, what is the strategy there for Maduro? Thank you, Emiliana, for that question. Thank you to everyone for being here. Having listened to the remarks of Deputies Pizarro and Gracia, I just want to provide a summary of this criminal, illegal activity and try to provide an explanation. What is clear is that the Maduro regime is illegal. The second term was not arrived at properly, and the international community overwhelmingly, and Venezuelans overwhelmingly, have rejected the illegal taking of this second term of Maduro. So let's just start with that premise. Second key point is that the Maduro regime has a single objective, and that is to take over the last independent power left, which is the National Assembly. They created a parallel assembly, the Constituent Assembly, to try to wrest power from the National Assembly. But as Deputy Gracia just highlighted, the international community has been really staying on the margins and hesitating to make any kind of investments because there is no rule of law. And the National Assembly is not approving any concessions. And add to that, that there can be no renegotiation of agreements for oil exploration. And you can add a whole list of activities to which Maduro doesn't have access right now because of that. So for 2020, it's clear for Venezuelans and for the international community, he's going to try to get that National Assembly by any means possible. What happened on Sunday and a few days ago demonstrates a few things. First of all, the regime is getting prepared. This is a strategy involved in preparations for the elections that constitutionally must be held in 2020. They traditionally happen at the end of the year in December, but they could move them up because, as we all know, everyone here certainly knows, they have been condemned in recent years because Nicolás Maduro controls all the institutions that manage these elections. The ultimate objective is to take over the National Assembly by any means necessary, and then there are, I'd say, three main consequences, right? This would give them access to more international financing options. Second, there'd be a crisis of legitimacy for Juan Guaido because he was sworn in as interim president because of his role as Speaker of the National Assembly. And then third, it would shut off the only avenue for democratic action right now. And it would take wind out of the sails of diplomatic pressure as well. So the challenge is enormous, and for the democratic forces within the country and for the international community, it poses a difficulty. We know what the Maduro regime strategy is. The question is, what should the countering strategy be? What support can be provided? Can we demand conditions for elections? There's a decision as to whether participate or not in those elections. Those are broader questions that go beyond denouncing the illegality surrounding the regime. Most in the international community recognize it as an illegal regime, but it's a complicated situation for the democratic forces to create a strategy that is supported internationally. And it's important, as we all know, the solution to this crisis and this tragedy leading to 5 million Venezuelans leaving the country. We want the solution to come from within, to come from Venezuelans. But as we've just heard, and given the drug trafficking, the links to terrorist armed groups, the democratic forces are facing an unconventional adversary. And so the message here is the interim government is firmly committed, as we saw by his actions. It's really the last window that is open. It's the last democratic institution. So yes, the solution should come from Venezuelans, but they need a lot of support. Deputy Pizarro, given your role as Presidential Commissioner to the United Nations, what are the possible actions that the international community could take, especially with regard to illegal mining? Are there sanctions we could apply? When is it enough? Because Maduro's seeking to evade those. Are those an option? Well, it's important to understand that sanctions by themselves are not a strategy. They're a tool that has to be part of a multi-pronged strategy. If there are only sanctions and no internal pressures, there's no chance. Thanks, Diego. If we focus only on mobilizing internally, but there's no pressure or support or isolation internationally, then it's impossible for us to produce the changes that are needed within Venezuela. It always has to be the combination of the two. The combination of Guaido continuing to resist pressures that are leaving the government increasingly isolated, social movements. We really need to connect politics with the social discontent. There are 5 million Venezuelan refugees because of the crisis. 8 of 10 medicines are unavailable in the country. The 60% of the population has a level of income that makes it impossible to cover their basic needs or get enough to eat. There are UN figures on all of this. So, given the assessment, what can the international community do? First, understand that the mining arc and all the illegal mining happening there is the only way that the regime can buy loyalty and buy complicity. So it's really a strategic focus for him, and it really changes the approach from the U.S. and Europe. They have to see these minerals in the proper light. The mining arc and all the systematic human rights violations that are associated with it have led to consensus with the Lima Group and Europe regarding human rights. The mining arc is explicitly mentioned in the September Human Rights Council resolution as the place where the worst violations are occurring. And in September of 2020, the fact-finding mission of the Human Rights Council will be providing a detailed report with testimony as to what's happening in that part of our country. Second, we've been talking with the UNHCR. Americo didn't mention this, and so I'm sorry I'm doing this on your behalf, but Americo de Gracia is from Opata, and ever since he denounced the mining arc for what it is, he hasn't been able to go home. He's been persecuted. He's in exile since 2018. He has not been able to go home. He has not been able to go back to his town because illegal groups were preventing him from doing that, from being safe. There's been a great deal of internal displacement and refugees, and so we have to activate the protection cluster. Lastly, speaking of the irregular groups, what's happening in Venezuela's mining arc is not just an environmental problem. It's not just destroying water and indigenous ancestral lands, but it's financing the ELN. It's financing irregular groups across the world. It's strengthening paramilitary groups, the colectivos, and that is leading to the creation of a parallel state. And a transition in Venezuela is inevitable. I think that's great. I'd love to have a crystal ball to know when, but we're convinced that change is inevitable. But a political transition would face enormous challenges. How do you territorially control the mining arc when it is completely controlled now by irregular armed and terrorist groups? And what would be the role of the United Nations? The what are the possible frustrations there with regard to the Human Rights Council and other bodies? To the Secretary General and bureaucracy and red tape and the United Nations, we could have a whole nother panel on that. The first frustration we might have is that there's a difficulty in understanding, a knowledge gap, sometimes because of ideological support. There is an understanding that the left in Europe sees us as the bourgeoisie and we don't understand and appreciate the revolution. But I'm from Petare. I'm from one of the poorest neighborhoods. Americo's from Upata, which is a place in the middle of the mining arc. But because of this ideological solidarity, there's a reluctance among part of the world to truly see what's happening in Venezuela. And they think that our approach is not that we don't want the country to have independence in terms of financing. And in the multilateral world, there's a tendency to see the conflict in Venezuela as a conflict between two equal political parties who just can't get along and can't agree as to how to move on and break the impasse. But that is not what is happening in Venezuela. We have victims and we have perpetrators. We have a state using every tool, all its power, all its resources, and illegal tools and parastate tools to subdue and subject a population. And the only thing the population can do is to highlight what's happening and organize and speak out. So from the UN, we want not just this fact-finding mission and its report, we want a deep, in Resolution 1373, we want a true conversation about what's happening in terms of Venezuelan gold financing irregular groups and the High Commissioner for Refugees and the whole international protection cluster should be activated to deal with displacement. And particularly in Europe, it's important that this situation is understood because it is the last bastion of support there for Maduro. I want to echo what Miguel says, that they are not puppets of right-wing international powers. They're both from left-leaning parties. Americo de Gracia, from your point of view, could you tell us about the human rights and environmental consequences of the illegal mining taking place, and the human rights violations that you've seen? I just wanted to add actually one detail to what my colleague Deputy Pizarro said, in the sense that this isn't an ideological debate, because that does not capture what is happening to us. This is an issue of right and left. This is the Venezuelan people up against a criminal organization. That's how we have to understand it. Miraflores is our government palace. Imagine it's Pablo Escobar in Miraflores pulling all the strings. Imagine the United States Supreme Court being presided by someone with a criminal record, because ours has been convicted of homicide. He used to be a policeman in DCIP, in the intelligence forces, and he was convicted of killing 2 people before he was named Chief Justice. That is what we're up against. That is the nature of the regime. And of course, human rights violations. We need to get on the right path to get out of this tragedy. We have the Pemon people who are being violently displaced. I'm not talking just about Americo de Gracia, who can't go home. I can't go home, sure, but there are many, many indigenous communities like the Umakapai. February 20th of last year, they were virtually decimated in a massacre that forced them to leave their community, and now they're living in Brazil. If it was just me, Americo de Gracia, if I was the only guy who couldn't go home, well, okay, that might be a different situation. But we're talking about entire communities that can't return to their homelands. They just wanted to defend their land against illegal occupation and mining, but we've got the ELN attacking entire communities, armed irregular groups, and these PRAN gang leaders. They're indigenous women who have been made sex slaves. It sounds very harsh to say it. In the middle of the in the 21st century now, these communities are being destroyed also by malaria, which is affecting the entire area. That is sadly the situation that we're seeing in our lands in Venezuela. That's why I was saying earlier that even if we could get rid of Maduro, south of the Orinoco, we're going to continue to have an enormous problem. It will be like what we experienced with the Balkans. We might see a split, because we're talking about a territory that's literally occupied by irregular armed groups, some of them Islamic terrorists like Hezbollah and Hamas, and others more like the ELN and the FARC. And then you also have the irregular paramilitary and criminal groups like those that we have mentioned.
Diego, and with the efforts by the Maduro regime to take the National Assembly, what is your perspective about the impact in the region, especially for 2020? Is there a strategy on the part of the regime to take control? I think there's collective agreement that what's happening in Venezuela, this crisis, is threatening stability in the region. I think there's general agreement on that. The ties to terrorist groups, irregular groups, international oil smugglers, systematic violations of human rights, torture, political pressure, persecution. We could do an entire panel about all of the illegal actions that are being committed by the government. Now, the Maduro regime does intend to extend destabilization in the region. Just to provide a specific case, in the Latin American Center, together with the digital forensic laboratory that also operates as part of the Atlantic Council, we've looked at the narratives and some of the disinformation coming from the Maduro regime. It's really important to look at this because this is on the ground when we talk about unconventional adversaries. We have seen examples on the ground of how they are trying to undermine democratic institutions and the control of communications and propaganda that's being pushed. We saw this within the United States. It's been one of the most relevant aspects to the previous elections. The regime continues to learn, and their allies do too, and they're trying to expand their influence in the region. That's no secret. So we have been trying to identify, expose, and explain some of this state propaganda that's being spread. I want to provide two pieces of data that I think are important and are illustrative and show how the Maduro regime is a threat to the region and intends to continue to destabilize the region. First is disinformation and the promotion of state propaganda inside Venezuela. As you all know, the traditional media in Venezuela are 100% controlled by the Maduro regime. There is no dissident voice or free voice to communicate any ideas, proposals, or even reports or denouncements. So, those who oppose the regime, which is a vast majority of the Venezuelan people, have sought out alternative ways to become informed. So they've gone to social networks, primarily. We work with Provox. This is an organization that works to identify sources of information. And from July, they conducted a study from July to October of 2019. They were looking at some of the trending topics on social media. Of these trending topics, Provox identified 50% as coming from and being pushed by the Maduro regime and its allies. This is a relevant piece of information. Something else that's extremely important to us, and we need to continue to pay attention to this. So 50% of pushing these trending topics occupied more than 90% of the engagements. So they have been able to have a much greater impact, and they have a very consistent strategy to influence the perception of Venezuelans and have used it to separate, provide disinformation, and create political polarization and disrupt any opposition. And now I'm getting to my second point, which I think is very important for some of those who are here today and those who are following us. Venezuela is not the only place where state propaganda is being pushed by the Maduro regime. We have seen it's the regime and their labs of disinformation and state propaganda, but there's another actor who we have to add into the equation, and Deputy de Gracia has mentioned this actor on several occasions. It's Russia, who is involved in some of the irregular activities, but also in efforts to undermine democratic institutions in Venezuela and the region. I wanted to talk to two media, RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik. These are media that are supported by the Kremlin. They have a version in Spanish aimed at Latin America and Latin Americans. They have been pushing, and they're growing, have increasing influence in digital discussions in Latin America. There are two pieces of information that I think are key to understanding this situation, the magnitude of the impact that these platforms and media have. We're not always up on how the level of penetration that certain media have. In 2019, we did a study in March as how much of Latin America was engaged with RT and Sputnik. On RT's Facebook page, they had more than 93,000 engagements and visits or hits. Then the second half of 2019 was an area marked by economic, social, and political conflict region-wide. If we look at Chile, we did a study in the Digital Forensic Laboratory. We were able to see that 20% of the accounts that were pushing information on the crisis in Chile were not just Venezuelan, but self-identified in their biographies as pro-Maduro, pro-Chavez, pro-regime. So in Venezuela, there's a threat to human rights. Ecocide, we have the presence of irregular groups, systematic attacks on democracy, and also the express intention with support from outside allies to destabilize the region. Deputy Pizarro, around the corner, we will have National Assembly elections. What is the position of the interim government in terms of participation? What are the minimum conditions for this? I think the first challenge is to move out of a binary discussion as to whether to participate or not. That's the current discussion in Venezuela. In Venezuela, you can vote but not elect. You can vote, but at the end of the day, you're not electing what's going to happen. So in Venezuela, we Venezuelans need to be able to decide our future. I think the entire international community, no matter which side, those are our allies who are most radical, who most support us, to those who are a little more lukewarm on it, must call for free, fair, competitive, and transparent elections, presidential elections. Now, in terms of the National Assembly, we have what's called a security checkpoint before you go to vote. So how can you have an election if you don't have an electoral council? On May 20th, 2018 was the beginning of the crisis because it was simulated elections. It was fraud that led to the fraudulent election of Nicolás Maduro, but without an electoral council. And I'm not just talking about the political class, I'm talking about the average citizen. How can they participate in elections that are effectively credible and viable? If we don't have a renewal of the TSJ, in the National Assembly in 2015, we had a huge majority with 14 million votes. We were able to gain the majority. In 2016, they started a series, more than 60 judgments against us that have been undermining our legislative functions, responsibilities, and authority, including as we try to pass laws. So we need to overhaul the institutions in Venezuela. It's not just this binary discussion as to whether or not to participate. That's a dynamic that favors the regime. The exit from the conflict in Venezuela is one that is going to be based on elections. We've talked about this in the past. We think that the only possible pressure is to ensure that there's an election-based exit to this crisis. But it seems that the regime wants to continue to undermine the vote. Those of us who are here have always thought there was a political way out of this. Just a week ago, I was talking to some European diplomats, and they were asking me how we have been able to avoid the temptation of resorting to violence. So if we were to put Venezuela in Africa or another continent, it might have been logical to have some sort of liberation army or to take up arms to destabilize the regime. And what we said, that we are very much against this. We want a non-violent movement because we represent the majority of the people, and that strength becomes a conviction. We want the majority to be able to express their views. When we can go to the polls freely, that will be the very last day of the regime, its institutions, and its power in Venezuela. Deputy de Gracia, understanding how complex the situation is in Venezuela, what are the plans of the interim government to put an end to illegal mining in Venezuela? What we've said is that the mining arc is a cross-cutting matter. If the regime is ousted or Nicolás Maduro is out, there will still be very serious problems in our territory. Since this touches on all aspects of society and government, we're going to need support and advice in all areas. I am convinced that all of you here are aware that in Venezuela there's a huge electricity supply crisis. And does this have anything to do with the mining arc? Yes, a great deal. People should know that, let's say, a transmitter is damaged or a light bulb. It's easy. All you have to do is go change the light bulb. What if it's a turbine in a dam? But what if it is the sources of water that feed the turbines that generate the electricity? How do we repair that? That's why we're saying that the harm caused in Venezuela through the mining arc is one that cannot be repaired in the short term. Colombia has spent 60 years fighting the FARC and the ELN. We didn't create the FARC or the ELN, but now they're in our territory. So how do we deal with that? We're going to need a great deal of assistance and support from many countries, many professionals and experts who will help us to resolve this. The matter of peace, the matter of health, the matter of the poisoning of our water. I think this entire panel knows that our water is not just being polluted, it's being poisoned with mercury. There's a difference. The three biggest cities, Bolivar, Guayana, and Upata, which are the three largest cities south of the Orinoco, get water from the Lagorde Lake, which is being poisoned with mercury and cyanide these days. So this is something that is cross-cutting. And then, of course, we've seen displacement throughout the zone. We are going to need countries that have had experience with this and tragedies like the one we're experiencing. We are going to need your support. We're going to need your assistance. One thing is getting Maduro out of power, and another is everything we're going to have to recover in terms of infrastructure and nature. There are 9 national parks in this area. One of these is a World Heritage Site. This park is in our territory. Today, it's easier to do mining in Park Manaiva than ever. So it's a cultural shift, it's a change that we're going to need to push. It's not just about changing the president, it's changing the model. And I think you all know how complex this is. We have to decolonize our zone. It's been colonized by violence. That's going to be a huge challenge for future generations that take on the role of doing so, as our friend and interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, is doing now. And we are all committed to this fight. We are all, those of us who are exiled abroad, Pizarro, Juan Andres, Adriana, myself, and the rest of us, we are all working in this direction. So we're here to spread the news and ask the world for your support to help us later recover our territory, help our people recover, and help us to attain the peace we so desire. We're going to wrap up with some Q&A from the public, but first I'd like to ask Diego, does the Atlantic Council have any suggestions for the interim government in the short term? Of course. I repeat, and every opportunity I have to discuss this, I say the same thing. This is an unconventional adversary. It's a challenge for the interim government to combat this, but for the rest of the world as well. How do we manage this? However, we know that there are leaders who believe that democracy is the path, that the elections are the path. We're all convinced of this. We're at a crossroads now because we know that the intent of the government is to take control of the National Assembly, however, by any means possible, and we know that National Assembly elections are on the horizon. I believe that President Guaido represents renewal for the country. What rests in him, in my opinion, is the future of a country of progress, of reconstruction. There's a plan in place to rebuild the country. This will be an inclusive country, an effective country, knowing that democracy is the path to that. Though it's symbolic, the fact that 100 out of 167 deputies supported his reelection, this went beyond party discipline. It was symbolic. I don't mean that there aren't conflicts inside the parties, but I think what this symbolizes, and where I think the interim government should move, is the decision-making process in such a complex situation. The majority of the group that are empowered, but there are different positions as to what the ultimate solution should be. So whatever the solution is, it has to be a consensus, and it has to take into account the perspectives of different sectors of society. I think the National Assembly deputies have to be the pillars of democracy, knowing that the adversary is unconventional, but they have to bring in civil society, NGOs that continue to operate in Venezuela, just the regular citizenry who are living the day-to-day tragedy of the country. Their family members have been killed or living in exile. If I could offer a suggestion to the interim government and to those who are here with us today, if we want to serve as an example, we have to make sure that there is a more open decision-making process, redistribute responsibilities so that there are many voices in coming up with the solution. In terms of the path to confront the regime, there has to be internal discussion. Obviously, we've seen the democratic alternatives, this idea of plata plomo, so silver or lead. We've seen the regime buy off some deputies with money. There's a moral crisis, but it creates the opportunity to push reforms that will help democracy to be renewed in Venezuela. Great. We're going to open up for some Q&A. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And can you please let me know how much time we have? Thank you. Good morning. My question is for the panel. I'm Jose Castillo, Venezuelan. I remember a few years ago in the university with my professor Juan Pablo Juanipa, and in discussions with him and the youth secretariat for Primera Justicia, we were talking about change in Venezuela had to do with how much people were willing to sacrifice and how willing the military was to repress people. But considering the situation, taking to the street means going to sleep without eating. How do you convince people to continue to take to the streets to push for change? Thank you. Who would like to answer? I'd be pleased to take that question. I think this has a lot to do. Well, thanks for mentioning Juan Pablo, because I can use his as an example. Juan Pablo Juanipa is the first vice president of the National Assembly. He is a deputy whose immunity has been violated. He's been persecuted. We had a discussion in December as to what to do with the leadership. And I'm going to cite what he said in answering your question. He said that they had the intent to face prison if it was necessary, because the only way to convince people that they need to fight is by example, through our own sacrifices. I received a phone call from someone from the regime before the judgment against me came out and said, today we are going to issue the judgment against you. You have 2 hours to run. And in those 2 hours, my first dilemma was, should I figure out how to get out of the country, or should I try to resist and live in hiding? I spent 2 months living in hiding, moving from place to place, until it wasn't any longer viable for me to do that. Juan Requesens, for the first time, was able to speak in his trial. I'm 32, he's 31. Juan is from the generation that it took over for us, and he was the one who came after me in my second term. After 500 days in prison, saying there was no judge, there was no prosecutor, there was nobody who could make him throw in the towel. This is the way we can reconnect with the people. We have to be self-critical. Sometimes we just spend our time navel-gazing, but all of Venezuela knows what happened on Sunday and what happened on Tuesday. And those in Washington are far more aware of what's happening than those in Petare or any other place in Venezuela. So that's on the one hand. I think we also have to, well, before you would send a couple of tweets and everyone would respond, but I think Diego has explained very clearly the control of the media. If we're not more old school, we're not going to be able to or if we continue to be old school, we're not going to be able to defeat 21st century media with old schools. So I think we have to make sure that we're putting an end to repression, and it strengthened the coalition that exists today.
Trade Bistro Advisory. First of all, the events of this weekend remind me of Boris Yeltsin in a more vibrant time in his life when he stood on top of the tank during the parliamentary sieges of 1991. So I pray that there will be good results as a result of people making many, many sacrifices. My question is for Senor de Grazia. Obviously, extraction industries are...
If you want, give me 2 seconds so we can
Certainly.
turn on the translator. If not, I'll translate as well. Yeah.
I sympathize. I'm not bilingual either. Thank you. Sir, my question is to you. Obviously, extraction industries are most important for the Venezuelan economy in the immediate future, oil, mining, and such. Does the interim regime or interim government have in place a comprehensive tax and investment policy that could counter the, frankly, garbage laws that have been passed in the last 20 years by the Chavistas and Maduro? Because, again, to attract foreign investment, there has to be a level playing field, the rule of law, and not only Russian and Chinese companies have to feel comfortable in the environment, but American and European and Brazilian and other companies need to feel confident that if they make the investment, they won't be surprised one morning with a negative tax consequence or worse. Thank you.
Sí.
Thank you very much for your question. And I apologize for not speaking English like my colleague Miguel Pizarro does. In Venezuela, there were clear rules when it came to mining, for example. But when Chavez, not Maduro, but when Chavez took control, he's the one who changed the rules of the game when it came to mining, and saying that he was a progressive. The first measure he took to make mining activity irregular was to shut down an institution that was part of the structure of the Guayana Corporation, TECMIN. It was mining technology of the Guyana Corporation. And then everything became chaotic. You saw illegal activities, and supposedly this was all in an effort to nationalize this. And then you saw Cristalet, World Reserve. We saw many suits filed against Venezuela. This was in oil and mining. So we need to have clear rules. You have to have regulations in place. You have to have an environmental ministry. The environmental ministry in Venezuela was the first one ever created in Latin America. That was back in the 1970s. So we had an institutional culture in place that was completely dismantled in order to create chaos and anarchy so that they were able to sack the sector as they saw fit. So hopefully the next government, the one that replaces Maduro and this tragedy, we will put order to this situation, and that will be for the good of all. And we would have to switch from a model that is not strictly focused on extraction, but create other ways of becoming a part of the global economy beyond just oil and mining. Tourism, industry, other sectors. We have to change this model of pure profits, and it's not just changing the president. We have to change the model look at a more productive leaning model that will help us to live, and private capital is going to be essential. Investment that might come from other countries into Venezuela. We need to provide them with respect. There will be mutual respect, respect for the environment, respect for the territories, for the indigenous peoples in the area, particularly in the case of mining. But we have to change the rules and make sure that they're no longer the rules that only serve the purposes of the regime, but those that provide certainty to other countries. Unfortunately, this is not the case of either the Chavez or the Maduro regimes.
Y
We have time for just one more.
Timothy Tell, diplomatico imperialista.
Former imperialist Yankee diplomat beginning under the government of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And my question is, why are you here if everyone favors your policies? And if we are going to, and when this is such an important area, and when our president is just focusing on the Middle East, why not tell our powerful Yankee powers that be, why not tell him that he's not a leftist? Just tell him that he's a criminal using gold, oil, and minerals to serve his interests, that he's in the pockets of Cuba, and tell our NATO friend, or tell them that our NATO bandit friend Turkey, that they need Venezuela's gold. We saw this similar things back in the Cold War. Thank you for that question. We share the sentiment of some of what you said. I mean, the reason we are here is that we are trying to influence the conversation about Venezuela. Venezuela, unfortunately, in the United States, in the media, is right in the middle of the polarization that this country is experiencing. And so we really have to explain that this has always been a bipartisan cause. We want to maintain consensus around the pressure that we need. Canada, US, the Lima Group, that has been the example that we would like to see the rest of the international community follow in terms of how it characterizes what's happening in Venezuela. But there's something else. Individually, none of us decided to be here. If you were to ask me where I'd like to be right now, well, I'll tell you, I would love to be in Patari announcing what President Guaido did on Sunday and Tuesday, and I'm sure Americo would like to be down in Petare helping the people there rise up against the regime. But our work has led us to be here. And I want to say, I really am a nerd. I don't just look like one because of my glasses. So I read 2 biographies in order to understand. And I read the biographies of Libertambo first, who was the right hand of Mandela, Nelson Mandela. And I took a lesson from there. The regime will only defeat us when we stop doing what we did to get ourselves persecuted and exiled. It's the last bastion of diplomacy. And that's what I'm doing, and what Americo's doing is focusing on the mining arc. That's all we can do. Yes, I think that the summary that Miguel Pizarro made is spot on. We are doing what we can and what we need to do now. I don't agree that Venezuelans are just sheep willing to sell ourselves for some subsidized food boxes. We have been subjected to immense brutality by the regimes of Maduro and Chavez. It seems impossible to understand how the German people back in the day aligned themselves with the Nazi regime. Well, no, it was the result of repression and domination. And the same was true of the Soviet Union. There are mechanisms that are applied and forces brought to bear. So at some point in time, we will see light at the end of the tunnel thanks to the efforts not just of the Venezuelan people in Venezuela, but also the Venezuelan diaspora, the congressional deputies like us who are in exile and continue to work from abroad. But thanks also to all the support and understanding from the international community. That will lead us to freedom and will enable all Venezuelans to be surrounded by democracy and peace. Well, Miguel, thank you. This brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thanks to our audience for being here.
If we could just remain in your seats, please.
Pido
Please. Please come on. Congressman, hi, Jason. How you doing? Please come on. Yeah, please. Thank you for that incredible panel. I am now thrilled to be joined on stage by two members of Congress who've taken time from their busy schedule to be with us today, and two members of Congress who have spent incredible time and energy and focus in supporting a democratic transition in Venezuela. So let me first start off by a round of applause for you, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Rooney, for all the incredible work that you are both doing in the House of Representatives to support a democratic transition in Venezuela. The previous panel that we just had explained the autocratic, the dictatorial actions of Maduro that yet again played out this week with his actions to try to subvert the National Assembly presidential election, but also revelations of the global links, including with global criminal and terrorist groups, of illicit mining, which I think is a real wake-up call that what's happening in Venezuela is affecting the Venezuelan people, but also incredibly infecting the world with a continuation of the Maduro regime. Let me introduce our two distinguished members of Congress who have joined us today. To my left, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz has represented Florida's 23rd Congressional District for 15 years and serves as a cardinal in the Appropriations Committee. Important to point out, also the first ever woman to chair the Military Construction and Veteran Affairs Subcommittee. She is also the Democratic co-chair of the recently formed Venezuela Democracy Caucus, and that is such an important effort, and congratulations to you on starting that caucus. Congressman Francis Rooney has represented Florida's 19th Congressional District for 2 terms and also serves as ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He also served as ambassador to the Holy See under President George W. Bush He is a member of the Venezuela Democracy Caucus, and Congressman, I'll add this to your bio as well, also a member of the Atlantic Council's U.S.-Colombia Task Force. So thank you for all of that work. A reminder for all of you who are tweeting, please use the hashtag ACVenezuela. As well, please note that we were to be joined today by Ambassador Carlos Vecchio, who had a last-minute family emergency and sends his regards, but unfortunately cannot be here. Let me start with a question. Both of you have been very active, as I mentioned, in the House and pushing for democracy in Venezuela. There are a number of Venezuelan deputies who are with us today. Miguel Pizarro, Americo de Gracia, Juan Andres Mejia, Adriana Delia. What is your message to Assembly members and also to the interim government following the Maduro regime's actions this week? And maybe I'll start with you, Congresswoman.
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for having us, and in particular for shining a white-hot spotlight in close proximity to the illegal, outrageous, undemocratic actions attempted by the Maduro regime to block the lawful constitutional re-election of the rightful president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, because the only way that we are going to make sure that we can have democracy restored is by shining light on darkness. I have the privilege of representing the district which has the largest Venezuelan population in the United States. My hometown is Weston, which is affectionately known as Westonzuela. So I am here on behalf of Westonzuelans and my community, which appreciates the work of the Atlantic Council so much. The actions of this week, where we saw a video of President Guaido literally needing to try to climb over the fence of the National Assembly to be able to enter for his re-election, shows that there are no depths, blocked by Maduro's henchmen. So it shows that there are no depths to which the Maduro regime won't sink to keep themselves in power and to stop democracy and to continue the abusive, abhorrent, horrendous treatment of their own people. Maduro has created the worst economic and humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere, and thankfully, democracy prevailed, and 100 members of the National Assembly were able to establish a quorum outside the National Assembly and re-elect Juan Guaido as its president. And he is rightly recognized by more than 50 nations that as the rightful president. We in the United States, across the aisle, we don't agree on a lot these days in the United States, but there is overwhelming bipartisan support at all levels of government that we need to make sure we do all we can to assist Venezuela in restoring democracy. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, I can tell you we have supported and appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars, $472 million most recently in the most recent budget in humanitarian assistance. I believe it's $41.4 million in direct support to the interim government, because obviously they're going to need to prepare for transition activities when we do finally see Maduro peacefully transition out of the power that he has he's had a stranglehold on. And we need to continue to do things like the Verdad Act, which was just passed and signed into law. That included the Russian-Venezuelan Mitigation Act that I was the lead sponsor of. Two other pieces of legislation by my colleagues Donna Shalala and Debbie McCarcel-Powell had legislation included in that package, along with Senator Rubio and Senator Menendez. We all worked very closely together. So we are taking an all-of-government approach to helping to make sure that we can go after the bad actors like Cuba and Russia, which certainly can't be ignored. Maduro would have fallen already without Russia and Cuba's assistance. No one should think that Cuba is a benign actor in this region. They are trying to spread the same anti-democratic, abhorrent actions that they perpetrated on their own people across the hemisphere. And Maduro wouldn't have a military that he could deploy, if not for the assistance of the Cuban regime. So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We'll go back to a question specifically around the Verdad Act in your Russia bill. Congressman Rooney, what's your message to Assembly members, interim government, and also in addition, what's your message to Nicolás Maduro? He's right now probably preparing plans on how to further subvert the will of the Venezuelan people, whether through political risks or also scheming on how to control the results for this year's National Assembly election.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for having me, and this is kind of personal for me. I've been going in and out of Venezuela for 30 years in the oil business, and Chavez and then Maduro took 14 of our rigs and let the Chinese start running them. We were the largest driller in Venezuela for 30, 40 years, and I've seen this great country that had a huge middle class, strong business, institutions, just absolutely ruined. It's a travesty of our time. And I'd just like to echo what Congressman Wasserman Schultz said, is that we are bipartisan, united, and ready to take this guy on and try to help Guaido and the courageous people like here that are trying to do something about it in every possible way we can. That means the bill that Debbie mentioned, the Verdad Act. That means extending these travel restrictions as much as possible on family members of the bad actors, going after their assets around the world. And to be really effective about it, we've got to step up recruiting the EU countries to join in that. It doesn't do any good to cut a guy off in New York when he could go hide out in Spain like Carvajal. And that's something that I think is going to be the next iteration of what we can try to accomplish. And then there's the aid, as is in Debbie's bill, to help Colombia, Peru, Ecuador with their refugee problems as well, because we don't want to see this contagion undermine our other friends in the region.
Now, I want to go back, Congresswoman, to the Verdad Act, which incorporated your Russia-Venezuela Threat Mitigation Act, requires State Department to provide a threat assessment and strategic approach for dealing with Russia's growing military sway in Venezuela. I talked previously that after this week's events, Sputnik, RT, were one of the first to congratulate the Maduro-appointed head of the assembly that was never democratically elected, and then the Juan Guaido was then democratically elected. But with Russia also involved in Maduro's illicit networks, as laid out also by Venezuelan deputies, what are the next steps the U.S. can take to further counter Russia's influence in Venezuela?
through the passage of the Russia-Venezuela Mitigation Act, we're going to be able to take action beyond just the assessment, because the assessment itself of Russia's interference in propping up Maduro is going to give us an opportunity to make decisions about what else can be done. But specifically, we are able now to levy even greater sanctions against Russia for Russians that are in this country. We can revoke their visas and deport them from the U.S. We can stop them, stop certain military assistance that Russia is providing from being able to get into the country to the degree that we have control over that, which is more than you might think. So using all the tools at our disposal to be able, because we remain a mighty country and have the significant influence and relationships around this hemisphere. We are going to use the law, now that we have had it signed by the president, to make sure that we can maximize our impact and diminish Russia's influence in the region, because they're not only involved in Venezuela, but they're a bad actor everywhere they can.
We talked previously about the Russian spread of disinformation across the region, specifically in support of Venezuela, of the
and in the United States.
Yes. Congressman Rooney, we heard in the previous discussion about the mining arc and all the illicit activities, and illicit financing from the natural resource extraction that helps to keep the Maduro regime afloat, the connection with criminal groups, terrorist groups. What are the implications? You were mentioning before, Congressman, how personal this is for you. What are the implications for Venezuela, but also, I think, the region and the world, if these illicit activities with international tentacles are not curtailed?
Yeah, I think the depth and breadth of his criminality, in terms of the illegal mining, the dealing with petroleum, the taking of people's companies. I know several people who got one friend of mine in the sugar business couldn't get packaging until he hired one of Chavez's middlemen who could get him the packaging. That they're ingenious in what they're doing. I know a guy that had a refinery and couldn't get any oil from PDVSA, so he sold it for a dime on the dollar to some crony of Maduro's, and now guess what? He gets all the oil he wants to refine. I know a couple of people that are flying Gulfstream airplanes that used to be corporate pilots for the large Venezuelan companies. Now they're flying some of Maduro's henchmen. It's everywhere. And so if that can continue unabated, what does that say about what could happen in Nicaragua, Bolivia? God forbid Ecuador's on a better path right now, but anything can happen in Latin America, and this is a really bad role model.
And Congressman, what are you looking at from the committee standpoint insofar as next actions?
Well, I think we'll continue to do what Debbie mentioned, is bring as much visibility to what's going on down there as possible. We've had Elliot Abrams testify. We've had a lot of really smart resources come and try to bring visibility to the depth and breadth of what's going on here. And of course, obviously backing in these legislative efforts to expand how we can sanction, expand how we can limit travel. I personally was quite disappointed that we let those 2 Russian aircraft land in Caracas, in La Guajira. I couldn't believe it. I think that was like a Cuban Missile Crisis, but we blinked. And we've got to do a better job.
I do want to add one thing that should be done, that the president does have the ability to do at this moment and has not yet done, and that is grant TPS for Venezuelans that are here. If there is any example of a country whose residents needed to flee to our country and cannot go back to, I mean, we are rightfully sanctioning Venezuela. We have declared them a rogue nation. We have acknowledged that that there is a rightful head of that country, not the one who's attempting to continue to run it, and yet the president has still not taken the action to grant Venezuelans here, who certainly cannot be expected to go back safely to their country, the ability to stay here until the crisis is averted. We have legislation that Congress has taken action on, and we passed that out of the House of Representatives. The Senate has the ability to take it up and send it to the president, and they have not done so, but that needs to happen.
Thank you. Congressman Rooney.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned TPS. That's a really good point. You look at the benefits to our country of the Salvadorians and the Haitians that have come in under TPS. And now, I don't know about the Venezuelans, but I know the Doral-Zuelans all have really good jobs, and they've revitalized Doral. I think the mayor of the mayor of Doral is a Venezuelan, and all these small businesses, you see them on the Hispanic media all the time. So they're contributing to our country. We need to figure out how they can be here.
Exactly.
If you permit, just in interest of time, just one additional question for each of you. First, Congressman, in addition to TPS, what additional actions, with a magic wand, should Congress take to be supportive of the Venezuelan people at this time?
It's imperative that we do all we can to get humanitarian assistance into Venezuela to assist the people of Venezuela, because obviously there is a balance that has to be struck when we sanction a country. There's no question that it makes life more difficult for the people who are living in that country. We don't want to make things worse for the people in Venezuela than Maduro already is. But at the same time, we need to make sure, which is why Debbie McCarcel-Powell's legislation that would have the administration do an analysis and develop a plan to get more directed resources through humanitarian assistance into Venezuela is essential. And that's part of the Verdad Act as well.
Fantastic. Similar question to you, Congressman Rooney, and also, how could the U.S., what is your opinion, how you served in the Holy See, how could the U.S. better lead coordination with some of its international partners?
Well, I mentioned the EU earlier, but the regime is so corrupt and in such bad faith that even the Vatican, who normally does a pretty good business of mediation of disputes, was not going to get involved because they can't trust Maduro to negotiate good faith. He's like the Yasser Arafat of the Western Hemisphere. And so I think that the most promising thing for us to do is to work with the EU, because they have a real stake in stopping the movement of these people. And as we know, there's an awful lot of money and resources that go through Luxembourg, go through Malta, go through Cyprus, and go through Andorra. And if we could close all those things off, we would be able to put a little more hurt on those guys.
And the OAS and the Lima Group, while they have certainly been doing the right thing, could step up and do a bit more and be a bit more aggressive.
Yeah. Well, I want to again start out by thanking both of you, and I want to conclude as well by thanking both of you, Congressman Wasserman-Schultz, Congressman Rooney, for your incredible work on behalf of the Venezuelan people, and frankly on behalf of the region, and frankly at a time of not, as you say, not agreeing on a lot of things, the importance of bipartisan support for the Venezuelan people at this critical moment. Having you both here at the Atlantic Council today, thank you very much.
And if I might, I put in a plug for our Western Hemisphere Committee. You couldn't find a better example of bipartisanship than the leadership of Albio Ceres, and he goes out of his way to make sure all sides are heard, and it's really one of the things that's not broken in Congress.
This would be why I wish Francis Rooney were not retiring from Congress, because making sure that we have voices that understand we need to work together and that we have more in common than we have differences, we can make a whole lot more progress.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.